There's a group of people who can remember rewinding cassette tapes with a pencil and also remember watching the first iPhone keynote live. They grew up dialing landlines, memorizing phone numbers, and knocking on friends' doors without texting first. But by the time they were building careers, the world had moved into inboxes, social feeds, and smartphones. If you were born between 1976 and 1985, you've probably felt this strange in-between status your whole life. Too young to fully identify with Gen X, too old to feel like a true millennial. For years, the cultural conversation tried to squeeze you into one category or the other. But around 2014, researchers started using a new term, xennials. Some sociologists even describe this group as a microgeneration because the time window is so narrow and the historical timing so specific. And that timing matters because something unusual happened during your formative years. You didn't just witness a technological revolution. You crossed it. You began life in a fully analog world and stepped into adulthood just as everything turned digital. That kind of transition doesn't just change your habits. It shapes how you think, how you relate to uncertainty, how you adapt, and even how you see yourself. So today, we're going to explore the psychology of xennials, what makes this in-between generation so distinct, and why living between two worlds may have quietly rewired the way you move through life. To understand xennials, you have to go back to childhood. You didn't grow up with endless notifications. You grew up with silence, with boredom, with long afternoons that stretched on without a screen to fill them. If you missed your favorite TV show, that was it. There was no streaming platform waiting patiently for you. If you forgot a friend's number, you couldn't just search their name. You had to remember it or walk to their house and hope they were home. Plans required commitment. If you said you'd meet someone at 7, you showed up at 7. There was no running late text, no blue dot tracking your arrival. You either trusted the other person would be there, or you didn't. That environment quietly trained a certain kind of patience, a certain tolerance for uncertainty, a different relationship to time. And then, almost overnight, everything changed. Right as you were stepping into adulthood, choosing careers, forming long-term relationships, shaping your identity, the digital wave hit. Cell phones became normal. Email became essential. Friendster appeared, then MySpace, then Facebook, and suddenly, connection multiplied. Before social media, most people had only a handful of ways to reach someone. A home phone, maybe a work phone, or just showing up. Within a few years, you were juggling messaging apps, online profiles, and a permanent digital presence. What makes this especially important is timing. Neuroscience tells us that the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for planning, adapting, and learning complex systems, continues developing until around age 25. Research published in Nature Neuroscience confirms that this region matures well into the mid-20s. That means many xennials were still in a highly flexible, adaptive stage of brain development when the technological landscape flipped. You were young enough that learning new tools felt intuitive, but old enough to remember life before them. And that combination may be one of the most psychologically defining features of your generation. When you compare xennials to the generations on either side, something interesting appears. Gen X largely encountered the internet as adults. For many of them, technology feels like something that arrived later, useful, powerful, but slightly foreign. Millennials, especially the younger half, don't really remember a world without it. The internet wasn't an addition to their lives, it was the background. But xennials experienced both realities while their identities were still forming. And that creates a kind of psychological bilingualism. You can sit through a long dinner without checking your phone every few minutes. Silence doesn't immediately feel uncomfortable. At the same time, you're not intimidated by new apps, new systems, or new software. You learned to adapt because you had to. You know what it feels like to be unreachable, to leave the house and simply disappear for a few hours. No GPS tracking, no constant updates, just presence. That memory shapes your relationship to privacy in subtle ways. You grew up in a world where embarrassing moments faded naturally. A bad haircut in middle school, a messy breakup, a night you'd rather forget. Those memories lived in stories, not in searchable archives. Psychological research on autobiographical memory shows that our brains don't store experiences like hard drives. Memory is flexible. It edits, it reshapes, it softens the edges over time. But when everything is documented, tagged, uploaded, preserved, that natural editing process changes. The past becomes less fluid, more fixed. Xennials experienced both systems, the erasable past and the permanent one. And that dual exposure may explain why many of you feel both comfortable online and quietly protective of your boundaries. Just as Xennials were finding their footing in adult life, another shift hit, this time economic. Many of you entered the workforce right around the 2008 financial crisis. You had done what you were told: get the degree, build the resume, work hard, plan long term. And then the ground moved. Companies froze hiring. Layoffs spread. Career paths that once looked stable suddenly felt fragile. For some, it meant moving back home. For others, taking jobs far below qualification. For many, it meant postponing milestones, buying a house, starting a family, feeling settled. The timing of this matters more than we usually acknowledge. Psychological research on economic instability shows that financial stress during early adulthood can leave a lasting imprint. When uncertainty hits during the years you're forming your professional identity, it doesn't just affect your bank account, it affects your internal sense of safety. Even after circumstances improve, the memory of instability lingers. You may become more cautious with money, more skeptical of institutions, more reluctant to fully trust that things will stay stable. So here's the paradox. Xennials were neurologically primed to adapt to massive technological change, and many of you did. But at the exact moment you were trying to build stability, the economy fractured. You learned flexibility out of necessity, but you may also carry a quiet undercurrent of, what if it all collapses again? That combination, high adaptability paired with underlying economic vigilance, is rarely discussed. Yet it may be one of the most defining psychological signatures of this microgeneration. Culturally, Xennials sit in a strange psychological middle. You were raised before helicopter parenting became the norm. Many of you walked home alone, stayed outside until the streetlights came on, figured things out without constant adult supervision. Your parents often didn't know exactly where you were, and that was considered normal. That kind of upbringing builds self-reliance. You learn to solve problems without immediately outsourcing them, to tolerate boredom, to manage frustration, to entertain yourself without an algorithm feeding you stimulation. And yet, by the time you reached adulthood, the cultural mood shifted. The early internet carried a kind of optimism. It promised connection, opportunity, and a democratized future. You entered your 20s at a moment when technology felt empowering rather than overwhelming. So you developed another trait alongside independence: collaboration. You learned to email, to network online, to build communities in digital spaces. You adapted not just to survive, but to participate. This creates a paradox that feels natural to you, but confusing to others. You can be skeptical and hopeful at the same time, independent but deeply connected, comfortable offline, yet fluent online. For Xennials, contradiction doesn't feel destabilizing. It feels familiar. You remember the before and the after, which means you can see what was gained and what was lost without fully romanticizing either side. And that ability to hold tension without collapsing into extremes may be one of your quiet psychological strengths. Living between two eras comes with trade-offs. You lost certain things: the ability to be unreachable without effort, the patience that came from waiting days for answers, a kind of undivided presence that existed before every spare moment was filled. There was more silence, more space, fewer comparisons. But you gain things too. Access to information your childhood self could never have imagined. The ability to maintain friendships across continents. Opportunities that would have been impossible in a purely analog world. You understand both sides of the equation. That's why many Xennials feel slightly out of place. Too analog for one crowd, too digital for another. Too cynical for naive optimism. Too hopeful for full-blown nostalgia. But that in-between feeling isn't a flaw. It's a skill. In a world that keeps accelerating, the people who have already survived one massive transition may be uniquely prepared for the next one. You've lived through proof that the environment you grow up in doesn't have to be the one you stay in. And maybe that's the quiet lesson of the Xennial experience. How to adapt without losing yourself. If this felt familiar, consider subscribing. And if you see yourself somewhere between the before and the after, you're not alone. There's more depth to explore in the next video.